This is the canned video of our first discussion session of the course Research on Corporate Transparency. I'm Jochen Gassen, but our guest for today is Christian Leuz from the University of Chicago. Christian will be charting the corporate transparency research landscape for us. So, Christian, over to you.
So now we're good. So we're going to do a quick overview, probably 15 minutes, 16 or so, 17, whatever minutes. And then give you guys an opportunity to ask lots of questions. And I saw the questions that you guys submitted, or at least some of them, and they're really excellent questions and lead to some good discussion. So I'm looking forward to that. So with that, let me sort of try to give you a little bit of an overview of how I think about transparency. And so to me, transparency is first and foremost an outcome. It's kind of a state. And what I wanted to point out first is that there's a connection between transparency as an outcome and regulation, because very often regulation is used to create transparency. And so the key ingredient or tool that we have to obtain transparency is basically disclosure. And so disclosure rules are at the core of many regulatory regimes. We know that as accountants. Financial reporting is an obvious example, but there's lots of capital market rules that require disclosure. There's bank regulation, and as I'll talk about later, lots of other applications where we have essentially disclosure rules. Now, corporate transparency, and this is again where it's connected with regulation, is also a recurring policy issue, right? The rules often expand after financial crises and corporate scandals. And one of the themes, I think, in transparency research is that to what extent are these reactions to crises and corporate scandals, are they overreactions, or are we making things better, right? And so Bengt Holmstrom, for instance, in his ECGI lecture, which I believe is also on YouTube or on the ECGI's website, so you can watch it, for instance, raises the question whether there's maybe too much transparency at this point, and to what extent that is hurting firms. And to just show you how there is this sort of connection, this is a really fun paper by my partner in crime, Lucy Hale, Ahmed Tahoun, and Claire Wang, that kind of looks at this connection between corporate scandals and regulations, and sort of shows how very often there's sort of a scandal that is followed by some regulation. And so what that means is that we need some careful research evaluation of the regulations, of the various costs and benefits. And this is where it connects with the piece that we gave you to read, or the sections of the Leuz and Wysocki overview that we gave you to read, is where we also talk about how, to what extent does our research lend itself to evaluating these policy choices and evidence-based policy making. And a couple of the questions that you guys submitted are in this direction as well. Now, if you sort of ask me big picture, what are some things that we've learned? I mean, obviously don't have time to get into this in 15 minutes, but there is substantial evidence on capital market effects, right? People have looked at share price, volume reactions, liquidity, cost of capital, and so on. We also have increasingly, this is one of the things that we highlighted in the survey as being more at, in the beginning, is market sort of wide effects, so more aggregate effects, which are really critical for the justification of regulation in the first place, right? So if it was just about firms have a cost of capital benefit when they provide more information, well, then that would give firms a pretty strong incentive to simply improve their disclosure to reap that cost of capital benefit. It's not obvious that you necessarily would need disclosure regulation and force firms to do that if there is this liquidity or cost of capital or valuation benefit to the firm, right? And so it is often when there's market failures, social costs are different from the private costs and benefits, that in those instances, we resort to regulation. And that's why, studying these externalities and spillovers Are there, for instance, for information, you can often make a positive information spillover argument. To what extent are they present? How big are they? And so on. Then people have also looked at real effects. And by real effects, I really mean these firm responses to the disclosure regulation, so that ultimately the firm doesn't just, we're not just looking at the response of the receiver, which is the capital market response, but also look, does that ultimately lead to changes in firm behavior? And that has come into focus more recently. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Right? And a final theme that we highlight in the survey that I do think is very important is that we still have relatively little causal evidence. And so what we mean by that is not that we don't have lots of papers on regulation, we do. But the point was more to illustrate that causal evidence or evidence that can be interpreted as causal is still relatively rare, but it's really critical to policy evaluation. So if you go back to my first bullet point, which is about carefully evaluating the cost of benefits, what we were highlighting is that we don't have that much research that we can build on yet that would necessarily could be interpreted as causal or be used in a cost benefit analysis in that sense. That, in my mind, is not sort of a stab or digging that literature. It's more sort of pointing out that there's still lots to do and pointing to the challenges and how hard it is to do that. Now, here's where I wanted to broaden it, and this is sort of where I like Joachim's sort of calling it the transparency landscape. I think, earlier I was saying transparency or disclosure rules are in financial reporting, banking regulation, capital markets regulation. Those are kind of traditional areas that I think accountants, finance people have studied. What I wanted to highlight is that, to me, this is much broader, right? We see transparency regulations in corporate governance to tackle corruption, to address consumer protection issues, right? Product labels, restaurant hygiene cards is the famous Gin and Leslie study. Healthcare, I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but also, and increasingly so, in environmental policies, right? So there's the Mine Safety paper by Hans Christensen and co-authors, which is a really great paper. And there's CO2 emissions. Saurabh Tomar, for instance, has a fun paper on this topic. So those, to me, also belong to the transparency landscape that we as accountants can contribute to. And what I think unifies a lot of these topics is that the public policy goal for them often is to change firm behavior, right? So it is precise, or individuals' behaviors, like doctors or and so on. So the idea here is not just to inform, but to also make changes to the behavior through the transparency regulation. And that is sort of why I was saying this has become a more recent focus of the literature that I believe is quite exciting. So why is this transparency regulation spreading? I mean, there's obviously other ways in which we could change behavior, through what people sometimes call a command and control regulation, where you just tell people this is what you got to do, or you tell them this is what you cannot do, right? And I think one reason for this is that we know with traditional regulation, where we have a long literature of various costs and benefits that people have pointed out how there's lots of unintended consequences, that people somehow think that transparency regulation is less intrusive. And so that the reason they believe that is because the mandate essentially prescribes disclosure rather than the actions. It basically just says, look, you have to tell us what you do. You don't have to necessarily do one or the other. Sort of more of a, it's sort of a more benign intervention is what people have in mind. And the question is that really true? I think is an important research question. Now, another reason why I think people use increasingly transparency regulations is that transparency is often viewed as a good thing. It's really hard, especially politically, to say that you're against transparency, right? Or that you think, being transparent is not a good idea. And so that makes it politically expedient and easier to kind of push through some of these regulations. And then again, as I was sort of already alluding to on the previous slide, forcing disclosure could make the undesirable behavior more costly. It's this idea of sunlight is the best disinfectant. We're exposing certain behavior. And then the idea is that by exposing it, we're ultimately changing firm behavior. And the place where we see this a lot and where it's currently really a hot issue is in the area of CSR or ESG reporting, where an important motive for many is to change firm behavior with respect to externalities, right? So the idea is firms don't necessarily, there's certain costs that they impose by emitting, say, CO2 on society, and they don't bear these costs, and they don't have incentives to, mitigate these emissions. But if we expose them, then the consumers, the people, will would either pressure the firm or impose some costs on the firm, and then that will lead to the internalization of these external effects. Right? That's sort of, I think, a theme. Now, what's important, I think, for us as researchers is to ask, is transparency regulation really that innocuous or that ingenious as people sometimes make it sound? Right? And so what I wanted to point out here is that there's lots of examples that it's not. I think two great pieces of research that I wanted to point out to that I think illustrate this nicely. One by David Drainoff and co-authors looks at physician report cards that basically do cardiac surgery. And one of the key results of that paper is that when the physicians had to, report these surgery outcomes, so infections, did people die and so on from the procedure, that the report cards had some improvements or led to some improvements in terms of the care, but a lot of it came through selection in the sense that the physicians were reluctant to operate on the sickest patients, right? And so what that highlights is that there is a pernicious sort of selection effect going on that came through the disclosure, which in this setting is not something that we would find appealing or would make us question to what extent the regulation actually worked the way we intended it. Thomas Rauter has a really interesting paper on extraction payments from oil and gas companies or mineral companies that basically shows when the disclosure regulation gets imposed. I mean, again, there's positive effects in terms of it looks like that the extraction payments going to these countries are going up. But at the same time, we again see some avoidance reactions where some business seems to shift to oil and gas or extraction companies that are not subject to the disclosure regime. So again, highlighting that it's important to think about avoidance just as it is for traditional regulation. We know from the multitask agency literature that people will then often, spend more time and effort on things that get measured, and that could be potentially problematic. I have some recent work with Matthias Breuer and Steven van Haverbeker where we point out that, imposing more financial reporting regulation on firms could actually in aggregate lead to less innovation. So highlighting that the proprietary costs aren't just a firm level cost, but could even at the aggregate level mean less innovation. And George Löwenstein et al., they have an interesting paper where they show when advisors are being asked to reveal their conflicts of interest, they actually feel even more licensed to be biased. So they give more biased advice because they just absolved of their duty to tell you that, they're getting compensated, for instance, from their or based on their advice. And as a result of that, they're not holding back anymore. So the point of all of this and this list is to say that there's many unintended consequences and problems with disclosure regulation as well. And so we need a careful analysis of these costs and benefits. So why is transparency regulation often difficult? Just to sort of point to one issue that I think is why I think this is worth studying and so important for us to understand. aside from it being really prevalent and common these days, the issue is that transparency regulation essentially works through a price mechanism, right? With command and control regulation, you tell people you can't do this or you can do only so much. That's limiting quantities, right? Whereas the transparency regulation sort of says we're going to put this information out there and then somebody's going to respond to it. And that response is going to impose perhaps a penalty on the sender. And that's what I'm displaying here, right? So there is a sender, a firm discloses, people receive it, think consumers, they're unhappy about it, and then their unhappiness is essentially a penalty for the firm, and then that makes firms change their behavior. But how the firm changes and how much they change very much depends on that response to disclosure. And so a lot depends on that consumers respond in the right way, right? And how do we know that consumers impose costs on the firms that would be equivalent to the Pigouvian tax, which is ideally what we'd like to have to happen, right? And it's not obvious that that happens or that consumers are, for instance, sophisticated enough to understand some of the more technical issues, say in the ESG or CSR space. So a few things that we have learned are that people respond, and not just investors, there's lots of evidence of that, but also the consumers. And that, as I was just alluding to, sophistication, people's knowledge matter, processing costs matter. So those are interesting areas that we have recently, I think people have explored this, and there's definitely more in that area that we can do. Companies care about these responses. So the feedback loop and the firm responses exist. So at this point, I think we're pretty sure that there is a firm response, but it's still important to understand, as I was saying, it's not obvious that the firm response is, as strong as we wanted or strong enough or, maybe too strong or in the right direction. So studying these issues is important. Here are some considerations for regulators: measurement, the avoidance strategies that I've afforded. Enforcement is a super important area. And then also understanding reporting incentives. And sometimes people, will say, well, I understand, obviously, when you have rules, you need enforcement of the rules. But I want to emphasize that even within perfect enforcement or with perfect enforcement, incentives still matter, because most of the time the rules leave discretion for good reason and deliberately. And then what happens within those rules, even if they're perfectly enforced, is still a matter of incentives. So that's why studying the incentives of firms to report is going to be really important as well. So in closing, basically, one final comment I want to make here is that people sometimes, when I sort of give this broad agenda of transparency research, people respond that by the question sort of, is this really accounting research? Is this really something that we as accountants should do? And my response to that would be, first of all, that regulation and standardization are core issues in financial accounting. And so my sense is that our insights that we've learned are really relevant in non-traditional settings as well. So I've recently done another survey paper on CSR and ESG reporting with Hans Christensen and Luzi Heil. And there, we've actually found it remarkable how many of the insights that we have, say, in the international accounting literature can be carried over or can be relevant and are really insightful when it comes to ESG or CSR regulation. Measurement is really critical for the functioning of transparency regulation. So if you think back at the drain-off problem, with the cardiac surgery report cards, what was the problem there is that the surgeon was worried that people wouldn't understand that, how sick the patient was on the way in. And so when there's a bad outcome, that could have to do with how sick the patient was to begin with, rather than what was done during the surgery. So to me, that illustrates that measurement is a really critical thing when we provide disclosure, and that allows people to evaluate the information in the right way. I've already emphasized that the real effects is really a critical part of this agenda, because that is often what motivates the mandates in the first place. And I really want to encourage you to push the boundaries of traditional accounting research. to go outside the domain. Think also about, there is sort of some recent work in labor. Think about the work and the labor markets of the accountants as also part of our domain. So really think of what I'm talking about today as sort of a call to arms for accountants. It's a large agenda. There's lots of things we need to understand, and especially need to understand it in a more granular way. A lot of the evidence has been on, or discussion has been around, should we regulate or why should we regulate? I think we need a lot more on the design, the implementation, the enforcement, sort of, how do things work? Because the how really matters a great deal, in the end, for the question of whether or not to regulate as well. And so I think there's lots of opportunities, and I'm going to leave the challenges to the Q&A, and let me stop here.
Christian, thank you. Thank you a lot. That was really a great introduction, let's say. 15 minutes with a tremendous amount of papers that you mentioned. It brings me to my very first question. So I originally thought that I could, in the meantime, pick some papers and put them into the chat for the students, but you were talking about too many papers in too little time. So would you be willing maybe to share your slides with the students, so that then we can do a game? The students can actually try to find all references in your slides and put them on GitHub. How does that sound? Okay, so game is on. Good, perfect. So now Q&A session. So first question. And we're going to start with a question by Rusha Nandi. So Rusha, can you just, unmute yourself, ask your question? I won't do introductions. So if you want the world to know who you are, then you can talk about yourself briefly, but otherwise just fire away.
Sure, thank you. And yeah, I would to introduce myself. So I'm a first year PhD student at NHH Norwegian School of Economics. And for my dissertation, I will be working on corporate governance and specifically activist investors, institutional shareholders to be more specific. So my question is about corporate transparency specifically. So I would say that one of the principal ways in which firms can be more transparent is to disclose more firm-specific information. However, one of the more popular debates in the accounting literature is that there are downsides of higher disclosure. For example, the loss of competitive advantage because of disclosure of more specific information. So if I consider from the managerial perspective, how should managers determine the optimal level of disclosure that should be done for his or her firm? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Hi, nice to meet you, Rusha, and thanks for your question. I think this is a great question, but also sort of a very general question. So I would argue that there's sort of evidence of lots of costs and benefits, right? So there's not just the cost that you highlighted in the question, but there's also evidence of benefits. So think about the evidence on liquidity. I would argue that that's probably the strongest evidence that we have, or the most solid evidence that we have. There's some evidence on the cost of capital. And so in essence, what managers in this context can then do is trade off these costs and benefit, right? As you pointed out, there's proprietary costs. I do believe that they're actually quite important. I mentioned the study that I have with Matthias and Steven in the overview, and that study highlights that these costs, even though you can also make arguments for positive spillovers, that these costs in the end can be big enough that firms might innovate less. And so in essence, I think each firm individually needs to think about, like, what are our capital needs. So if you have lots of growth opportunities and capital, external capital requirements or external financing needs, then the cost of capital is going to be really important to that firm, and then they're going to put more weight on that. If the firm at the moment can fund a lot of its internal projects internally, then maybe the cost of capital is less important, and they're more worried about the proprietary cost. So that is in essence, things that firms individually or managers need to get a handle on, and they might not always think in the categories that we think. But generally speaking, I would trust that managers are making trade-offs between these costs and benefits. And precisely because of that is why also regulation is tricky, because you might be forcing firms to disclose something that in the end outweighs the benefits for them, and why they would rather not do that, right? And to me, that is one of the key reasons why disclosure regulation is such an interesting topic.
Yeah, okay, that was really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And also one thing in that regard, so we have 2 units of theory coming up. And then you think about theory is and often very much about the question of optimality given constraints. So to get your head around this, I think the next 2 units could actually be really interesting. Okay, so turning over to another interesting topic, that will be Caro Walz now asking a question. Caro, please unmute yourself and fire away.
Yeah, hi. So I had a question about sustainability reporting. Like I was thinking, since we're kind of reaching a point of no return when it comes to the climate crisis, like whether you think that it could be useful to make it mandatory for firms, like, or also maybe through a global standard, since it's a global problem, like, because when we consider maybe the benefits and costs, like the benefits of saving the planet kind of would be greater than the cost for firms of imposing it like mandatory. And yeah, whether you think that disclosure and transparency are sufficient to make a change in that case.
Yeah, so this is a super important question, Caro, and nice to meet you too. So this is a question actually we could probably have an entire course on, because I think this is a big and important topic. Let me maybe point you in 2 directions in the beginning, and they're going to be 2 shameless plugs for my own stuff. So there is a overview paper that I've done with Hans Christensen and Lucy Heil that we're at the moment updating it. So don't read what's on SSRN right now. We're going to post a new version probably within the next week. And that is because a lot has happened on the question of the mandate. And so we just went through it one last time and updated it to the question of the mandate. Essentially, the question that you're asking, what can we say from research on the question of, on the question of a mandate? And so that paper, I think, is sort of would be a long answer to your question. And then I'm also going to record a podcast that should be available soon on this question with Scott Bogus at UT Texas. So with that, let me get into sort of a few things I want to quickly say. So one is that I think at this point, a mandate is pretty much a foregone conclusion. We're going to get one. And the reason we're going to get one is like the IFRS Foundation has decided that they're going to go forward with the SSB. And Europe, I think, we already have a mandate for some of this information. And I think Europe is pushing very hard to go further. My sense from the US is that even the US is going to go forward on a mandate. Now, the question is that there's basically 2 very different approaches to such a mandate, right? You could look at this and say, really what the drive or what the momentum is about. A lot of the momentum is coming from investors, so that people are basically arguing that CSR information, especially with the climate rules that are going to be imposed, the CO2 limits that are going to be imposed on firms, there will be cliff issues. There will be basically, transition issues that have impact on firms. And as a result of that, CSR information is or will become material to investors. And the view is firms are not providing enough of it. So there's essentially sort of a non-compliance view of it. And the idea then would be to provide standards to clarify what firms have to provide in those instances. Now, the other view is more related to my talk earlier, is that people are basically using CSR information in lots of areas to drive change. They basically have this idea that if we expose enough how much CO2 a company emits, then that will make companies sort of pay a price and will do less. Now, in my mind, if you ask me, because you asked, should we have a mandate, is at the moment, I don't think we can clearly say that the benefits would outweigh the cost, or should we have one. But one of the key things that I would say we can say based on the literature is that the case for the former is relatively strong, meaning we have quite a bit of evidence that there is from papers that there's non-compliance in certain areas that probably are material to investors, right? And so But a lot of that is already required under the existing disclosure frameworks. So in my mind, if it really is about giving investors what they want in terms of material information for their decision making, then the accounting rules are actually, or take the US framework that I know best, there is a requirement to provide material information already in there. If we're going to go further and we say we're going to drive change, then in my mind, the case becomes less clear, because there could be, as I was talking about in the opening, lots of unintended consequences of pushing out information or forcing firms to provide this non-financial information. And I would also point out that forcing or driving change by forcing firms to disclose, in essence, is just like other regulation that normally needs a democratic legitimization. So one of the important questions we should be asking is, who gets to decide what change we're driving, right? And so for the climate, I think, and this is why there's a broader consensus on climate, I think for the climate now, there is a broader consensus that that's something that, policymakers and people want. But in lots of other areas, that's not so obvious. And so an important part of this debate needs to be who gets to decide and how do we legitimize this democratically. So let me stop here so that we get to the other questions. But this is a super important topic.
Yeah, so and it's also that Caro is not the only person interested in this topic. So we have a follow-up question in the chat that Ulrich Atz will ask real quick.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Christian. My name is Ulrich Atz from NYU Stern School of Business. And so I perused your paper on CSR regulation. It's very interesting. I personally are sort of trying to, make my dissertation around ESG and its consequences. And I think you anticipated my question a little bit just now. I was wondering, so what do you think are the research findings and sort of concerns about the power wielding aspects of companies when it comes to influencing a regulation? We know from, the history of tobacco and oil companies, they've been extremely successful in doing so. And I guess, do you have any sort of specific recommendations of what we should do when we implement ESG regulations?
So first of all, nice to meet you as well, and I think it's a fascinating question, and this is an important topic, right? It's the idea. I think what you're highlighting with your question is we very often, start talking a lot about the should question, right? Should we have regulation and so on, and not enough about sort of will this get implemented. And the influence of companies on the implementation process is, in my mind, a subject worthy of study in itself, right? So I think I would be excited about this topic of yours. Maybe a couple of pointers here, just sort of since you mentioned the tobacco industry. I don't know whether you guys have seen the movie. It's a documentary called Fed Up. It's about the sugar industry and how they have basically avoided more regulation on sugar and the sugar contents in food, and how that feeds into the epidemic that we have in terms of obesity. Super fascinating. I would highly recommend for you. This would be a really interesting thing to watch. The other pointer I could give you, take a look at what the Stigler Center at Chicago does, and especially some of the work by Luigi and Raghu. In my mind, this whole notion of how, in the end, we need to save capitalism from the capitalists because they have such a strong incentive to kind of influence the rules of the game. In my mind, this notion that you're pointing out of what you call power wielding aspects of companies, this is one of the things that breaks Friedman's famous sort of argument for shareholder value. I mean, there's sort of another way to break it is through the idea that shareholders care more than just about the NPV. And so Luigi and Oliver Hart have this paper on welfare maximization rather than value maximization. But one other aspect that's really critical is that if companies influence the rules of the game through their political processes, then the Friedman maxim doesn't make sense anymore. And so to me, to study that is super important. So really good question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your pointers.
Okay, thanks. So now we're moving over to a question which is more general, but nevertheless also very interesting. Ariana Pichella. Ariana, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation and for organizing this course. It's really a great opportunity for all of us. My name is Arianna Piscella, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. So my question is, since your paper was published in 2016, I was wondering if there are any key findings or key aspects of your research that do not hold true anymore today, or that should be even challenged by future research?
So that's also a great question. Thanks, Ariana. I mean, first of all, I would say, 5 years is not a long time in academia, right? So in that sense, I don't think the landscape has, shifted in a massive way. The broader insights, I mean, the paper is very broad brush, right? I think, in parts, it reports on research that was done on particular regulations. That won't change so much, or there hasn't been like a new paper that completely changed, at least that I'm aware, on some of these older regulations. But it's usually the case that we study these regulations and then, we move on to another regulation. Now, what I think has changed is I see much more work on these real effects than when we wrote it. We essentially wrote it in 15 or finished it in 15, and then it came out in 16. So in that sense, a lot of this work in ESG, CSR, and other non-traditional settings has come, which I think is very encouraging. So to me, that's the biggest change that I see. But I don't see that work has sort of challenged or changed some of the broader insights. But I hope eventually we will learn new stuff, and some of the things that we maybe have claimed in the paper will get overturned, and that would be great.
Thank you.
Good. So in our order of questions that we designed, we now move over to something that I entitled settings. So questions related to how research can be pulled off and what to focus on and which type of settings to use. And here we start with a question by Lisa Lübke. Lisa, over to you, please.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the presentation. I really like to read the paper, and I got interested in the idea, like how this can be implemented to work with regulators in order to get results, or to use this to get results in analyzers. So how can this be implemented? Is that the researchers come into contact with the regulators in order to undertake this, or is it the other way around? Because in times like this, in Corona times, it seems like the regulators are reaching out for researchers to get results. But how is it if there's not a crisis? So are the researchers supposed to go to the regulators? And yeah, this is my question.
Great. Nice to meet you, Lisa. This is a really tricky question. And the reason it's tricky, in my experience, as you were pointing out in the paper, we're pushing very strongly for this collaboration, because as I pointed out in the survey paper, or we pointed out in the survey paper, data is really critical to causal identification, and having granular data is what often affords sort of pinning a response or some kind of outcome to the regulation. And very often we have fairly aggregate outcomes that make it very difficult to kind of make this causal link between the regulation and some of the outcomes. And so in that sense, getting more data would be critical. My experience is that most of the times the initiative needs to be taken by the researchers. They come with an idea and they say, this could be studied. But I will also tell you that in my experience, the regulators are often quite concerned, and to some extent, understandably so, right? It's oftentimes what it requires is that you establish sort of a rapport with them, that there's trust and mutual understanding. They have often highly sensitive data. But I would strongly argue that we could do much more if people would make data available in a confidential way. There's great ways to anonymize data, and it is not enough happening on that space. So I would encourage all of you to approach regulators, to push them to do this, find ways to do it. But I will also tell you that it's often a long process. It's often hard to do, even when you have sort of an established reputation. So it will be even harder for young people to start out doing this. It has been done, right? There's examples like Reg SHO with the SEC. The PCAOB had a short period of time when, Luigi and I were working with them. They were very open to working with researchers. They didn't necessarily do experiments, but they were very open to the idea of like some kind of staggering or, certain thresholds that would facilitate the regulation. To maybe point to one other issue is, first of all, you have to understand that a lot of times in regulators and especially policymakers often have legal backgrounds, right? So lawyers often also think about what could go wrong with your research and what could go wrong if they kind of engage in an experiment. So it often takes sort of convincing people that the alternative of not doing anything is also dangerous, right? So there's lots of poor regulation. And so to me, this argument that, if we try something, it might have costs, that's true, but there's also costs to the alternative. So that's important to point out. If we really want serious policy evaluation, as lots of regulators will say they want, then we need data, we need their help, and we need them to be involved and to partner up with the researchers. And having them do it won't work because regulators rarely are staffed in a way that they would be able to sort of do this. And so it's this partnership that I think ideally we would want to have. The second thing that's holding back is also that there is often a legal requirement in countries that regulation cannot be arbitrary, so that it can't be legally challenged. And so in the problem with randomization, for instance, or putting firms in a treatment and in a control group is almost by definition will mean that it's arbitrary. And so there's a real legal challenge at the moment also going on in the US that's debated in the courts as to whether the SEC can even do something like that without violating certain legal rules or principles. And again, I think what people need to understand that there is a cost to not doing that. And that's still at the moment, I think, still heavily debated, and there's no clear answer to that question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'm supposed to ask a question on behalf of a student here, and this directly follows up to the question that that Lisa just asked. It's also related to this idea of cooperating with regulators. And so what is the focus of this question is more of the decision of a regulator to actually do this, and it touches on a cost-benefit consideration. So if you as a regulator, you want to impose a regulation from which you expect to have positive net benefits, and then if you do a staggered adoption, then maybe some firms would benefit earlier than others, and so how do you think this trade-off can be achieved, or observed or studied?
I think the way I think about the question is very similar to the way we think about medical trials, right? So if you think about the COVID vaccine, the people who got the real stuff and it was working, also had a benefit earlier than the people that got the placebo. So I think this is something that you always have in those instances. And if you look in the medical arena, when we very quickly find that something is incredibly successful, we at times break the trial at that point and then give it to everybody for ethical reasons. For companies, sometimes I would argue the argument is maybe not quite as strong as if you're doing, say, cancer research or something like that. But at the same time, it's a little bit like a systems argument. If in the overall we're making the system better off, and we're really randomly drawing companies on regulations, then sometimes you get drawn early and other times you get drawn late. And so I think over time this should even out, and we all benefit from the improvement of the system overall. So I would say these are things, they're legitimate concerns. We've seen them in all the areas, but at the same time, I think we should debate them and should come up with ideas and rules on how to address them.
I like your idea, because that in the end would lead to an FDA type organization that has to approve regulations in the economic environment. That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, although again, I think one thing that's really tricky, because we are driving behavior, I think a legitimate, a democratic legitimization of the regulation process is different from, does a drug work or not? So I think there are important differences.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so now we're going to move over to the method section of questions. Now, the method section does not mean that we are talking econometrics now for 15 minutes straight, but we will talk a little bit maybe also about terminology. In that regard, Ariana has a very, I think, fundamental and important question.
Yeah, thank you again. So yes, it might seem a naive kind of question, but since I began my PhD, I started really to be picky about terminology. So I wanted to ask you, you use very often together the terms disclosure and reporting. Are these two terms, can we use them as synonyms, or are there fundamental differences in their meaning that we should bear in mind?
So again, a good question. So let me explain why we did this in this paper. So first of all, I would say you could make, I think, distinctions between disclosure and reporting. The reason we use them kind of more synonymously and kind of interchangeably in the paper had to do more with sort of the history. I think if you look in the, especially the US literature, people often use the term disclosure either generically in the theory papers, and I was coming more from the theory side. So to me, disclosure was a very generic term, right? It was kind of any kind of report, and it doesn't have to be the annual report. It could be on the website. It could be a management disclosure in a meeting with analysts and so on. And so but the US literature very early on was sort of more thinking of disclosure was kind of like the footnote disclosures. And then reporting was like the annual report and the income statement and the balance sheet and so on. And we didn't want people to think narrowly of the paper as being about footnote disclosures, but very broadly about any kind of disclosure. So that's why we used the term disclosure and reporting in a very broad sense. And then when you use them in a broad sense, I don't think they differ that much anymore, which is why we use them interchangeably. But there are clearly different venues, and to study, there is, for instance, a big debate over recognition versus disclosure. Does it matter you have it in the income statement or the balance sheet versus you have it somewhere in the back? And that's an important literature, but in that sense, disclosure is used in a much more narrow way than we use it in the paper. Joachim, can I make one more comment on the earlier question with regard, since that was specifically about staggering, I want to make 2 points about it since we're now in the methods section. The question wasn't about the methods, but I do want to make a quick comment. First, the way I think the question was originally posed was also that anticipation is often a threat to the identification when you have staggering, right? So I just want to emphasize that point, since we're now talking about the methods, is that when you have staggering, it's not a panacea. It's the staggering can work, but you often need the right variables that really allow you to exploit the staggering. If you have a variable that's highly anticipatory in nature, like the cost of capital or stock returns, that will often undo the staggering. And so that's important. That's one important point. The second point I want to make that's not in our survey paper, but has recently come up, and I would point you to a really nice paper that just posted on SSRN by John Barrios on staggered adoptions. There's a lot of work in econometrics and econ that's come out in the last 2 years about how these staggered regressions, or actually any two-way fixed effects. So, if you looked at my work, there's lots of two-way fixed effects, meaning there's sort of like a time dimension and there's a cross-sectional dimension, like a group fixed effect. Those regressions can have serious issues because they're essentially weighted averages of lots of treatment effects. You're averaging over lots and lots of different experiments, essentially, and that can bias your treatment effects or cause issues. And so John points you to that literature in economics and shows like there's a Stata package, there's several Stata packages how to implement it. So go and check out that paper. I think that's pretty important, given that we're highlighting how staggering has advantages from the identification point of view. You should be aware that there's also some recent issues that have been raised about these approaches.
Yeah, so I'm now playing the advocate for the master students. They're currently struggling to understand what staggering is. So staggering means that you have a regulation that not affects all firms at the same time that belong to the treatment group, but at different points of time. So they are staggered in adoption. So this was a service to it. Okay, so now I'm also asking a question on behalf of a student, and the student was also thinking about identification in these real life settings. And I think one thing that I would like to sample out here is a little bit the self-selection that can result from regulatory treatment when you only observe, for example, publicly listed firms. So, as we know, there's a lot of research being done on publicly listed firms. And, you can think about every transparency regulation to have an effect also, let's say, not on the intensive, but also on the extensive margin, basically. So what happens to the firms that actually delist? And how should this affect our research designs?
So I'll say two things about this question. So first of all, I think it depends a little bit on what you're chasing or what you're trying to study, right? So if the idea is that you want to understand what the outcome of a particular regulation is, and say if 30% of the firms avoid the regulation by basically delisting or going private or something like that, then that affects the outcome of the regulation and maybe means that the regulation was less effective than you originally thought. And it's in that context that the avoidance reactions by firms are actually a really important thing to study. I think that's worthy of study in itself, right? So that I would emphasize first of all. Now, if you are interested in more, if the regulation really isn't what, you're not trying to do an evaluation of the regulation, but you're more interested in the regulation kind of as a treatment. You want to know, does a certain disclosure have a certain outcome? Then you care less about these avoidance reactions. Then you care about what happens to those that were forced to disclose. But you have to understand that you're still then estimating sort of an average treatment effect on the treated, right? Because these chose not to avoid, right? And so in that sense, you still you're getting a treatment effect. And so if you're interested in the possibility of a treatment effect, then that is interesting, but it doesn't necessarily, represent what you would have gotten in the population if you had forced everybody, which is the ATE, the average treatment effect. And so in that sense, you have to be careful about, what is a threat to your question or the answer that you're giving to the question, or is it, in itself interesting? And depending on what you're chasing, I think the answer is going to be different. But I think studying these avoidance reactions is super, super interesting and something that I would encourage people to do as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I have to say I'm also a big fan of your answer, because exactly this discussion about local treatment effects or the heterogeneity of treatment effects in that regard, this is something I would like to see more often. So this is really exciting stuff. Now we're going to turn over to, let's say, an old-time topic of accounting measures. And Tobias Witter is going to ask a question.
Yeah, hi Christian, hi everyone. My name is Tobias Witter. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Humboldt University. And my question would be, in your 2016 paper, you write about reporting quality. Accounting research has not yet found a satisfactory way to empirically identify reporting quality. And now, as a PhD student, you read a lot, and accrual-based measures of reporting quality, they're used for more than 30 years, frequently updated, and still many studies rely on this. For example, when you look in his SSRN accounting newsletter of the past weeks, you see it several times. So I would be very much interested in your view. What's the current state of the literature of reporting quality? Where's the debate heading there? Which proxies do you find meaningful? And would you still like to see a study using these proxies published in JAR?
Okay, so great question, Tobias, and great to meet you too. Let me, when you originally submitted a question, you actually even said, that you found this to be a strong statement in the paper, right? And so I want to reiterate that it is a strong statement, and I stand by my strong statement. And I mainly do this to kind of challenge you guys to push harder. I mean, if you think about it, what we're about as a field, right? We're accountants. We should be really good at measuring reporting quality, accounting quality, whatever you want to call it, right? And if we now look at what have we produced in terms of measures of this quality, if we're talking about sort of more narrowly sort of accrual quality or the quality of the firm's financial reporting in the income statement and the balance sheet, I think we have not produced a measure that works all that great. And in particular, what we don't have, and the reason we make that strong statement in the paper, is that the core issue is that we're not separating the underlying economics from the accounting quality really well, right? And note that this is, when I'm saying that, I'm not blaming the people who, did this early on and saying this, they just didn't think hard enough. This is a hard problem because the accounting is to depict the underlying economics. It's sort of integrally connected to the economics. So this is a hard issue, but it is core to the accounting. We need to basically find better ways to separate the underlying economics from the accounting in order to be able to study the effects of accounting quality, reporting quality, or whatever you want to call it. And all of the existing measures, think, all the discretionary accrual measures, think the Chow and the Chef, all of these measures commingle the two. And that's why we made that strong statement. They all reflect things like the operating volatility of the firm, the operating performance of the firm. That's what we're showing in research after research, is how they reflect performance, how they reflect operating volatility, how they reflect the underlying business process, like the operating cycle, and how we're not getting these things separated. On top of that, the economics of the firm drive the reporting incentives, right? Whether the manager has an incentive to obscure or to be transparent is also a function of the economics. So this is really hard. So to give you a couple of more positive pointers as to what we can do, right? So first of all, we should stop using discretionary accruals, right? There's just no point in this like two-step. First, we throw in a few variables, take out the residuals, and then use some additional controls. I mean, there is information in accruals. There's nothing wrong with accruals. That is an important outcome of the accounting process. But you can put accruals, if you're interested in studying them, on the left-hand side, and then you need to think about what would you want to control for on the right-hand side, right? So again, first of all, I think this two-step thing with a few controls and then the rest comes later doesn't make sense, and there's some statistical issues with that as well. Secondly, I don't understand why in the rest of the disclosure literature and the accounting literature, we've moved a great deal in the direction of using careful designs, like design-based studies, fixed effects, RDDs, or any kind of other method to kind of distill the effect that we're looking for. Why we're not using that more in the reporting quality or accrual quality literature? The same should apply there. Those are going to be means for us to say, here are two firms where I'm trying to hold the economics constant. Now I'm shifting the accrual quality, and now let me see what the outcome is. And so to give you an example where this is happening is take a look at Ilyev's paper in the JF, right? He has this RDD design. That is, and he studies accruals. I'm pretty sure that there, with the RDD, what you're picking up is probably an accounting effect as opposed to the underlying economics, because the design will take out a lot of, or hold constant a lot of the underlying economics, right? That's in my mind fine. And then you will see also in the Ilyev paper, there's almost no difference between the discretionary accruals and the total accruals. Hence my point about why not just, use the total accruals. The other pointer I want to give you is this work by my colleague Valeria Nikolaev on accounting quality, which uses sort of a more structural GMM type approach. And what he shows in his work is, again, this issue of how all the other measures, almost by construction, commingle the underlying economics with the accounting. And while his approach may not be perfect either or require certain assumptions, in my mind, it's a fundamentally different starting point. It's starting with the question of how can we separate the two, and then writes down sort of conditions under which you can, and then estimates them, right? And then we can relax, we can change. To me, that is the sort of a step in a different approach. So either use design-based approaches where you kind of use it through your design, or go down this more structural route that Valeria was showing.
Thanks a lot for that. So we have 6 minutes left. This is going fast, I have to say. By the way, if you're a master student and you think that, oh, this was all very technical, you can play around with our GitHub repo and see for yourself, because there we actually estimate discretionary accruals, and you can see how they look like, and then you will get second thoughts about using them in your analysis, I guess. But you know, play around with it. Okay, so now I would like to call on Rebecca real quick to ask her question that she put into the chat. Rebecca, please.
Hello, Professor. I'm Rebecca. I'm a student of Humboldt, of the Masters in Economics. Mike, first of all, thank you. The presentation was really great. I also read the paper. It was really joyful to read that. And one thing that caught my eye is when you spoke about different fiscal years on a firm level basis. And it seems that one of the biggest challenges when we are doing empirical studies is limiting and isolating the effects of new regulations. So if we have such different fiscal years on this firm level, couldn't we use this to isolate and have some sort of separate control groups for our empirical analysis? Also, how limited or beneficial this approach would be, and if the information of the change in the regulation would be completely absorbed by the agents before the regulation actually takes place, or if we could have some time for this staggered setting to be true.
Yeah. Hi, Rebecca. Good question. This goes back to a little bit the discussion that we had earlier also about the staggering, right? Yeah. So first of all, I think this is a tool that we as accountants should use more often, but again, not kind of like in a sort of just because Christian said it, we're going to now use it anytime we can, but in a sort of thoughtful way where it helps and maybe not do it when it doesn't help. So as you already, I think, answered yourself in the way you asked the question, is when there's lots of anticipation, then it doesn't really help that you have, say, staggering from the fiscal year ends, because if the market kind of already expects everybody to do something, then it doesn't really matter that one firm does it in December and the next firm does it in March, right? But for instance, there can be settings where, and I'm pretty sure that once you think about it, there's going to be lots of settings where it actually matters if and when the information is available. So where we use this, for instance, in the context of IFRS adoption and liquidity, right? And there you can make the argument, if you're worried about trading with a counterparty that has better information than you have, so you're worried about this adverse selection problem, then what matters to you is the information if and when you trade. It's not the information that I know half a year from now the firm provides better information. That maybe help me if I have long holding periods for my stock, then it might help me that, you know, when I offload the stock, that I have a better information environment and I might already take that into the account. But at the time I'm buying, it really matters, does at that point of time, you know, do I have better or worse information environment, right? Or think insider trading regulations. You know, it matters if and when I trade, whether the insider trading provisions are in place or not in place, and whether people could get punished for insider trading or not. And so then I price protect. So there can be settings where the staggering rule may make a difference. and be it fiscal year ends or whether a regulation comes into place on, or into force in March or in June or September or whatever. So thinking about this carefully in the context of your design and the variables that you're looking at. Are these fast moving variables? Does it matter at the time you're measuring them, or the critical considerations that you'd have to have here? And then, with any kind of staggering, maybe another methodological point of staggering, the identifying assumption is somehow that the timing is going to be exogenous, right? And that is something that worthwhile to consider as well, that, fiscal year ends are not randomly assigned. Regulation usually is also not randomly sort of sprinkled in terms of time. So thinking about what gives you the exogeneity and the timing is going to be very important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of interesting questions, and now I have to decide what we do. Okay, so there was a very good question by Jeremiah about the association between the open data movement and this whole transparency debate. I think this is really interesting to ponder on. Maybe you can say a word on this. And then I just changed some questions now. So Rusha also.
Joachim, the open data, what's the open data question?
So, okay, so so Jeremiah, feel also free to skip in. But here in the context of the broader transparency landscape definition, how can this be distinguished from the open data movement? So is open data just another form of transparency, or is this different? And if it is different, how?
I guess it's transparency for the research process. And so, we can study the research process too, and we can study transparency in the research process. I actually have a project on. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to clarify the question. So when I talk about open data, I'm not talking about open data in the sense that a researcher publishes open data or does open science, but rather that the institutions or firms are actually publishing data sets with sort of a more maybe general remit than just sort of publishing their yearly financial statements, but rather they're offering maybe a higher degree of granularity that on the one hand maybe has downstream accounting uses, but also could be used to generate other types of value that then maybe changes the cost benefit analysis as well of transparency.
Yeah, I think the latter is quite different from the former, right? So this, do researchers provide their data and make it available? Those are more, I think, questions related to the research process. Should companies, or when companies provide this data sort of in real time and in a disaggregated question, then I think we're getting into interesting questions related to both timeliness, like, what's the advantage of like real-time disclosure or very frequent disclosures? Like people like Andy Van Buskirk had a paper on monthly revenue reporting. You could think of that sort of as a baby step in that direction, and pointed out that there's sort of some trade-offs here if the information comes more frequently. So the frequency question, I think, is an important question in that context, as is the aggregation, where you're going to get into information processing, literature, and so on. So in my mind, those are interesting issues. And they could also come into play in the context of more blockchain type of applications, right? Because there's going to be more transparency around individual transactions and transaction level reporting. So I don't know how much or how deep we've gotten into these issues, but I would say right now they're related to these issues of frequency, aggregation, and definitely worthy of study. And then on the first one, we can clearly study the research process as well. I wanted to give you an example that I actually have had a project for many, many years where I'm finally hoping that we're going to put this on SSRN that studies disclosure of conflicts of interest in medical research. So it's studying the research process of medical researchers and the disclosure regime by the journals that requires that you disclose when you've been funded, wined and dined, or an advisor to the drug industry.
So last question maybe, but I'm really impressed. We still have 170 people, although we are over time. So about research that is done in other fields that we could benefit from as accountants, and research that we do that you would like that other fields would pick up more. Any final thoughts on this?
I mean, I think, you know, part of what the question gets at, is there enough cross-fertilization, right? Is there sort of something that we could learn from each other? I mean, it's actually fascinating how much overlap there is across areas, in, for instance, in this area of transparency, right? So there's quite a bit of people in, like, in medicine, they're interested in the question of disclosing these conflicts, or they're interested in, I remember there's papers on disclosure regulation for sugar content in food, right? They're going to be interested in that. Obviously, finance and economics has done a lot of work and interest in transparency issues. Sociology has as well. So there's a lot of overlap and joint interest. Part of the problem is that we organize conferences by field rather than by topic, right? So all the accountants get together and then we all talk about accounting issues, rather than to say, today we're going to study food labels and transparency that's created through food labels. And then you have people from different, we've tried this jar, for instance, with securities regulation. We had a conference where we brought together people in law, economics, and finance around securities regulation together with the accountants. So it can be done, and I would highly encourage that. I would also say that the accountants have a lot to contribute to these areas. I think the notions of accountability, right, that matters, for instance, for government issues a lot. So people that study public policy schools are going to be interested in those notions. You know, I think, you know, Joachim is part of this larger transparency network that's studying transparency issues in society more broadly. There's lots of, I think, opportunities there. And then measurement. I mean, as remember my talk with the Drainoff paper, you know, measurement is something that accountants, especially, like, we have talked a lot about external accounting, but internal accounting can matter. Like, give you one more pointer. If you're familiar with the work that Nick Bloom has done on management practices around the world, shows some really large effects on productivity and explaining productivity differences across firms. And there's some really nice work by John Barrios and Mike Minnis that tries to say, well, maybe this has to do with their accounting practices. Maybe this is related to how well the firms are able to measure what they do internally. And so again, an example where I think accountants could potentially play a role and contribute insights.
Thank you, Christian. That was very insightful. So I learned a lot, and thank you for everybody who actually, you know, sent in questions, asked questions now in the chat. Apologies to all of those who could not, you know, whose questions we could not address. I think that doesn't mean anything about them, right? It's just that, you know, time was up.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks for having me, Joachim.
Yeah, but it was a pleasure. Thanks for doing this. So I have two things to say. So next thing is obviously on May 3rd, we're going to talk about disclosure theory with Alfred Wagenhofer from Graz. So Alfred is a absolutely leading figure in this field, and he's also very good in communicating theory knowledge to empiricists. So if you're thinking that maybe theory is not my pond, then I think you will be surprised. It will be very interesting, I promise. In the meantime, you know, next Monday there will be new videos. For those of you that don't do the Q&A, on Wednesday we're going to have the Q&A session. And if I can ask you guys for a favor. So we talked a lot about papers, many papers today. Yeah, so many papers were mentioned in passing, and I've seen Carol posting a paper to the chat. I would really appreciate if we could do a little bit of crowdsourcing effort here, and, you know, just dig out some of the papers that we talked about, and if you find them, you know, put them either on YouTube or put them on GitHub. Open an issue, maybe papers. Maybe let's open an issue. Why not? GitHub issue papers that Christian talked about. And just, you know, push the paper there. And maybe if you say, hey, this is a crap paper, I don't know why Christian likes it. No, you should say, of course, you should. We love the papers that Christian talked about, but maybe you find another paper that you find interesting or whatnot. And we will, you know, obviously moderate this a little bit, curate this a little bit, but we can help each other out here. Yeah, so just take the time. Yeah, find one paper, post it there, DOI link. Yeah. So don't put a PDF there if we don't have licensing rights to it. We have to take it away. But you know, a DOI and reference would be great. and let's see where this goes, right? So thanks everybody again for tuning in. This is it. Yeah, enjoy the afternoon or the day if you are landside US, or the night if you are in the East, I guess. And see you again soon. Thanks for showing up, and bye-bye. Have a great day. Thanks,
Thank you
Kristen,
all.
again. That was awesome.
Bye.